This is Daryl with Cisco Hands-On Training. Today we're going to have a theory class. We're going to talk about how to pick iOS versions. So Cisco iOS version selection tactics. The website is ciscohandsontraining.com, and for feedback you can email ciscotraining@mac.com. Some administrative stuff. One person provided feedback that suggesting an audio-only podcast version. As you know, this is a video podcast, so I sort of intend for people to look at the screen and see the commands and see what's going on and see the output. But not everybody has, video iPhones, and even if they do, sometimes they just want to run and listen to stuff. So so I seek your feedback. If you want an audio-only, if you think an audio-only podcast version would be good or bad. Putting the feedback in the website would be good. I also received multiple people requesting episodes on different topics, MPLS, IS-IS, QoS, frame relay. I'm teaching what I know and what I've used operationally in production, so I have the perspective of having seen, real deployments and real outages. I've only used MPLS in production once. I have never used IS-IS outside of a lab. My QoS experience is okay, but still mostly lab-based. So I don't expect to teach classes on, in particular, MPLS. But if there are some listeners out there that have a lot of experience with MPLS and want to put together a video showing an MPLS demonstration or an IS-IS demonstration or a QoS demonstration, I'd be happy to consider putting in a guest episode. So you send me the video, and if I like it, if it's good, if I think it's appropriate, I'd go ahead and add an episode for it. And that way you can help give something back and help other people. Another note, I got my first Juniper certification, the JNCIA-ER, which is the associate level enterprise certification. And that's just another way of me telling you that the learning never stops. In this business, you always have to keep on learning, pick up new skills. For today's presentation, I'll post it in the episode. I'll attach it in the comments, the episode comments on the website. So let's get into today's episode, Cisco iOS selection tactics. There are a gazillion iOS versions out there. There are a gazillion releases. And there are different feature sets, and you need to decide which ones to use, and that's what today's episode is about. Let's talk about Cisco iOS Packaging. This is something that came approximately 12.2, 12.3 in iOS, a new way of packaging up the features. So you have a layer 2 base feature set, which is just for basic layer 2 switching. You have a LAN base, which adds ACLs and QoS, and then you have an IP base, which includes some very basic routing like EIGRP-stub and RIP, and then you have IP services where they add the common routing protocols, OSPF, EIGRP, BGP, high availability, NAT. Then you have the Advanced IP Services package and the Enterprise Services package. Advanced IP Services, they added on both of those they added IS-IS. They added IPv6, although with the most recent code version, Cisco is rightfully moving IPv6 to be equal parity with IPv4. So, for example, in 12.2.33SXH, in order to get IPv6 functionality, you need to get Advanced IP Services feature set or the Enterprise Services feature set. But with 12.2.33SXI, the IPv6 features have been moved to the same level as IPv4. So if you want OSPF version 3, which is for IPv6, you can get that with the IP Services bundle in 12.2.33SXI. And that's reflective of the fact that the internet has about 90% of the IPv4 address space allocated to the regional registries, and as a result, we're expecting to run out of IP version 4 addresses in 2012, and the IPv6 global deployment will soon be upon us like a freight train. And then the Advanced Enterprise Services has everything else, including many non-IP services. So if you want to run AppleTalk, or if you want to run IPX, you will, well, IPX I guess is in the Enterprise Services, but if you want to run AppleTalk, if you're going to find that, you're going to only find it in the Enterprise code set. Okay, so those are the packages. Now the question is, what package do you want to pick? Well, when you're buying a router, you often have to pay more money to be authorized to install an advanced service pack. So if you want to install advanced IP services on a Cat6K, you have to pay extra for that. If you want to install an enterprise image on a 3845, you have to be able to pay more money to do that. So from a financial standpoint, you want to buy the smallest package necessary. In addition, from a reliability standpoint, the fewer features on a box, the fewer bugs they have, and the smaller amount of memory they will use, and the smaller amount of flash it will take to store the image. So if you are deploying layer 2 switches, you don't need the advanced IP services feature set on that layer 2 switch. You just need the basic layer 2 switching, the layer 2 base image, or maybe the LAN base image, depending on the platform. But if you're deploying a router which is going to run OSPF, then you need the IP services image. If you deploy something that runs IS-IS, then you need the advanced IP services image. If you deploy something that needs AppleTalk, you deploy the advanced enterprise image. That's so the best thing to do is to think of what features you might need, not necessarily now, but in the future on that box, and buy and install the minimal image for that. The other thing to keep in mind is K9 means SSH. At least in countries that are not under export restriction, so the United States is not under export restriction, and so on. If you're not under export restriction, I suggest you get authorized to get the crypto images, download the crypto images from CCO, so that way you can install the images with K9 in them, which means that you have SSH enabled. Because if you're logging into a router, you want to have your password encrypted when you're logging into the router so nobody intercepts it. Always deploy SSH code versions if you can, and in particular, many PCI audit requirements, SOX audit requirements, generally they want you to use have your routers be secure, and one of the components of securing your router is to use SSH for management. Even if you're not limiting yourself to SSH for management today, you would hate to be in a situation where you have to do a bunch of code upgrades a year from now to enable SSH on your boxes. So just get in the habit of always picking the crypto image with the K9 if you're legally allowed to do so. Okay, that's iOS packaging, and if you go to www.cisco.com/go/packaging, you will find this image that right on Cisco's website. Let's talk about the technology train lineage. 12.3.1t is an example of an iOS release, and the T, there are different trains of iOS releases. The capital T here means that this is a technology train, and 12.3.1t was the first image of the technology train. The technology train is where new features are introduced into iOS. So they install new features in 12.3.1t, a gazillion new features, and then they do one rebuild where they generally just do bug fixes, and then another rebuild where they generally just do bug fixes. And then they have another release where they add a substantial number of new features, and then they have a rebuild where they do bug fixes, and a rebuild where they do bug fixes, and then another release where they add new features. So these features, new features means new code which is not widely deployed previously, and as a result you have new bugs. So the technology train is risky to deploy because you're deploying code that is not as mature as other code versions. So you need to avoid deploying the technology train on your routers unless you need one of those new features. Now, if you need a new feature that is introduced in 12.3.2t, then you have no choice but to deploy something after 12.3.2t. So the question is, given all of these choices here, which one would you choose? Well, if you choose 12.3.2t, that was right when the new features were introduced. If you use 12.3.2t2, then you have 2 rebuilds since that feature introduction, and those rebuilds probably did not introduce new features. So 12.3.2t2 will tend to be more stable than 12.3.2t. Now down here is one that's interesting, 12.3.11t11. So back here, 12.3.11t, a bunch of new features were introduced, and then now we have 10 rebuilds in a row where very few or no features were introduced. So 12.3.11t11 will at least have a significant chance of being stable. So that's the technology train. In general, you want to avoid it, but if a new feature was introduced in the technology train, you might have no choice. And here's the release notes, which you can find by doing a Google search on release notes for Cisco iOS release 12.4t. The release notes list all the new features, so probably too small to see on your screen, but here's 12.4.15t and a gazillion new features introduced that even scrolled off the screen. The mainline train, at the end of the technology train, so 12.3.14t7 was the last 12.3 technology train image. And at the end, what they do is they say, we're done with this technology train. We're going to make 2 copies of that code. One copy is going to become the new 12.4.1t, the new technology train where they introduce new features. The other copy goes into the 12.4 mainline release, which is 12.4.1. And from that point on, in the 12.4 mainline release, they introduced very few new features. Their goal is to introduce none. The marketing reality is that they have to introduce, occasionally they have features that are so absolutely critical to the customers they have no choice but to introduce it, or a feature might be so minor they feel that there's little risk in introducing it. So in all of these, so the mainline train is where you want to be. The mainline, if the 12.3t train is where your feature was introduced, then there are 3 trains you can use. You can deploy 12.3t, you can deploy 12.4t, which of course has all the features from 12.3t, or you can deploy 12.4 mainline. Well, once the mainline is burned in a little bit, and right now at least when I looked at this, prepared this slide deck, it was 12.4.23 was the mainline release. So we had 23, well, we had a huge number of releases and a huge number of rebuilds within each release. And so 12.4.23 should be very stable because it has been literally dozens of releases with very few features since the last substantial number of new features was introduced. So if you have the opportunity, if you have the choice, deploy the mainline train. And then here's a list of mainline features. They list all the new features in 12.4, 1 mainline, and then you can see there were 3 new features introduced in 12.4.3, and then a couple rebuilds later in 12.4.3d there was 1 new feature, and then only 3 new features in 12.4. Actually, I'm sorry, these are hardware features also in 12.4.3. So there were 6 features in 12.4.3. You can see a very small number of new features here compared to the technology train. And then they keep on, they are introducing a few new features in 12.4 mainline. Okay, well, now if you're running Cat6K, Catalyst 6000, you can't run 12.4 mainline because 12.4 mainline does not support the Catalyst 6000. In order to run on the Catalyst 6000, you need to run the 12.2 SX train, which is a special offshoot of the 12.2 S train, which is a special offshoot of the 12.2 train. So, okay, so the Catalyst 6000 guys, they have their own train, and let's look at it. We'll just start at 12.2.18 SXF10. What does that mean? Well, it's originally an offshoot of 12.2.18, which is a mainline train, and they made a copy, and they called that the S train, which is a service provider train. Then the Cat6K guys made a copy of that, and it was 12.2.18 SX chain. And then they added some new features. And when they added some new features, originally it was SXA, and then they added more new features, it was SXB. Eventually you got to SXF. And when you got to SXF, they added new features with SXF, and then they did a rebuild, and that was SXF1. And they did another rebuild, it was SXF2. Eventually they did 10 rebuilds, so now you're getting to a pretty stable spot, 12.2.18 SXF10, and then they did a minor rebuild where they just introduced a few bug fixes, and that was 12.2.18 SXF10A. And then they did another rebuild where they did a significant quantity of regression testing this time. So they, instead of going with a 10A, they went to 12.2.18 SXF11. And then they did another rebuild, and that with the regression testing, and that was 12.2.18 SXF12. And then they needed some new features. In particular, one of the key new features was the 16-port 10 gig card on the Cat6K. So they added that new feature, and when they added the new feature, they made a copy of the code and they called it 12.2.33SXH. But they know that some people don't need that feature and they just want incredibly stable code on their Cat6K. So they continued developing 12.2.18 SXF with another rebuild, 12A, 12.2.18 SXF13, 12.2.18 SXF14, 12.2.18 SXF15, 12.2.18 SXF15A, 12.2.8 SXF16. These are all rebuilds with no new features or very few new features. So 12.2.18 SXF16 would be expected to be a very stable version of code, which is good, but it does not support the 16-port 10 gig line card, which is bad. If you need to run the 16-port 10 gig line card, then you need to run 12.2.33SXH. But 12.2.33SXH introduced a substantial number of new features. The 10 gig line, the 16-port 10 gig line card, for example, that's where the VSS, the virtual switching system, was first introduced. So if you don't need any of those new features, and you have a choice between 12.2.33SXH and 12.2.18 SXF16, you want to go with the SXF16, because SXF16 has had at least 16 releases since the last number of substantial features were introduced. 12.2.33SXH is brand new code. Well, then what they did is they started doing minor releases on the 33SXH. So 12.2.33SXH1 has very few new features. 12.2.33SXH2 has very few new features. 12.2.33SXH2A is just a rebuild of SXH2 with just bug fixes. 12.2.33SXH3, SXH3A, SXH4, SXH5. So you can see with SXH5, you have, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 new releases or rebuilds since the last substantial number of features were introduced. So if you have a choice, so if you require the 16-port 10 gig line card, then your choice is you can choose 12.2.33SXH or 12.2.33SXH5. Best to pick the SXH5 because it's had so many a substantial number of rebuilds since the last substantial number of features were introduced. Then they added more new features. The virtual switching system had some serious limitations in the SXH code. They added new features to the virtual switching system to allow you to update the code on the virtual switch without having them both down at the same time, which is pretty darn useful. And that's what they introduced that in 12.2.33SXI. So you can see they changed this letter at the end. That's not a 1, that's an I, when they introduced major new features in the Cat6K train. And then since then they've had one new bug fix release, 12.2.33SXI1. So if I need the 16-port 10 gig line card, but I don't need VSS, the new VSS features, then my choice is I have 12.2.18 SXF16, but I can't run that because I need the 16-port 10 gig line card. I can choose 12.2.33XXI1, but that has a lot of new features here and only one release since then, or 12.2.33SXH5. And that's the winner. That's the one which has 7 releases or rebuilds since the last major set of features was introduced, and So that's the best choice given my requirements for the 16-port 10 gig line card. If I don't need the 16-port 10 gig line card, and I don't think I'm going to need it in the future in that particular box, then 12.218 SXF16 might be the right choice today, because that has 16 releases since the last major feature introduction, which is, over a year of bug fixes. So that would be incredibly stable code. And then here's some screenshots of the 12.2SX new features in some of the rebuilds. So you can see the 12.218 SXF10, we did have one new feature introduced, a OC48 card, which is a new hardware feature. And then 12.218 SXF10A, no new features. 12.218 SXF11, no new features. This is from the release notes. So you can see they really try to minimize the new features within the train, except when they're altering the letter. But occasionally they have to make exceptions. Another way to look at it, from release 12.233, I'm sorry, that's 12.218 SXF12 to 12.233 SXH, they introduced 215 new features. So you can bet that 12.233 SXH has a substantial number of new bugs. And my terminology for that is a medium release. It's not a major release, it's not a minor release, it's a medium release. And then from 12.233 SXH to SXH1, they introduced only 6 new features. So you can see there's 2 orders of magnitude fewer features with just the number change at the end. And that's a minor release. 12.233 SXH1 to 2, they introduced 2 new features. 12.233 SXH2 to 2A, no new features, and that's just a rebuild. 12.233 SXH, I got this mixed up. That's actually SXH. Dyslexics of the world untie. So 12.233 SXH2 to 12.233 SXH2A. No new features, 1 new feature, 0 new features, 2 new features, 0 new features. And then here, from 12.233 SXH5 to 12.233 SXI, they had 101 new features. So you can see 12.233 SXI would probably have a significant number of new bugs, whereas 12.233 SXH5 is probably in pretty good shape from a stability standpoint. Let's look at the technology train for new features by release. 12.3.14 T7 to 12.4.2 they introduced 60 new features. That's the first release of the 12.4 technology train, so that is a major release. And then 12.4.2 to 12.4.4, they introduced 64 new features. So you can see they're introducing features like mad in the technology train. And then they just have 12.2.4 to 12.4.4 There might have been a T1 and T2 in there. Those are just rebuilds, and it was only 1 new feature. So you can see from a stability standpoint, if you're required to go with the 12.4 technology train because you need a new feature, then 12.4.4 would be a better choice than 12.4.4 because 12.4.4 you just introduced 64 new features, but 12.4.4 only had 1 new feature. So you can see with the technology train, every time they rev this number inside the parentheses, they introduce a large number of new features. But when they rev the number after the T, it's just a rebuild. And so you want to go with instances where the number after the T is larger to at least have some stability. Again, you want to avoid the technology train entirely if you can, because that's where gazillions of new features are being introduced. Mainline train. 12.4.1 was a copy of the 12.3 technology train. So all the features that were introduced in the 12.3 technology train are counted as new features in 12.4.1. There are 536 new features. So the mainline train is where you want to be, but you don't want to be at 12.4.1. And then they try to minimize new features from then on. So 12.4.3 is a minor release, and it had only 6 new features. 12.4.3D is the 4th rebuild of 12.4.3, and they introduced 1 new feature. 12.4.5, they have a bunch of other rebuilds here too. They do rebuilds in the mainline train by incrementing a small letter inside the parentheses. So 12.4.5 is a minor release, 2 new features. 12.4.7 minor release, only 4 new features. And some of these features are really trivial, like new SNMP, or maybe it's a hardware feature where if you don't have that hardware, that code wouldn't even be used at all. And then by the end, 12.4.16, 1 new feature. 12.4.17, 0 new features. 12.4.18, 1 new feature. So you can see the mainline train, very few new features. That's where you want to be. Here's some examples of recent features which narrow down your choice. The virtual switching system actually was introduced in 12 for the Cat6K. That's where you have 2 Cat6Ks act as 1 virtual switch. It was actually introduced in 12.2 SXH, but that has serious limitations, so it's really only acceptable to use the VSS in 12.2 SXI. And then the 16-port 10 gig card I mentioned was introduced in 12.2 SXH. And then a 3G HWIC, which is a way to plug in a 3G card to a router, was introduced in 12.2. Actually, I think it was 12.4.15T. So you can see you're stuck in the 12.4 technology train if you need this 3G card, and that 3G card is pretty useful in remote sites because you know, if you have some you know, if you have a retail store or something like that with a router there, the retail store is a T1. But if the T1 goes down, you don't want the store to be unable to process credit card transactions, right? So you back it up you back up the T1 by putting a 3G card into the router. That's a very common deployment scenario, but that would force you to go with 12.4.15T. Okay, so the iOS selection strategy. The platform often determines the train. So for example, if you're running a Cat6K, Catalyst 6500, you need to run the 12.2 SX train. You need to determine if there are any recent features that are absolutely required. You want to avoid recent features, of course, but you know, if you need a 16-port 10 gig card, you need a 16-port 10 gig card. Nobody's going to argue. So you want to pick an iOS version with minimal new features, but with recent rebuilds, and lots of rebuilds since the last feature was introduced. So let's go through an example. So in Cisco's website, you can get to the point where you download software, and there's a place up at the top where you download iOS software or router software, and then down below switches software. If you're downloading software for a switch, it's simpler to go with the switches software because it's more organized for the switches. And then otherwise, I go with the Cisco iOS software. I haven't tried out the router software. Hopefully, it's as simple as the switches software. So let's go through the switches software example. Ends up being LAN switches, you expand it up, and then Catalyst 4500 series switches, you expand it up. Let's say we need code for a 4507R-E, which is the new enhanced version of the 7-slot 4500 switch. And then it asks you for the Supervisor Engine in that box. This is sort of deceptive. It makes it look like there's a separate iOS version for each supervisor. In some cases, some of these use different code versions, like the SOUP2 or the SOUP1, but like the SOUP6E and the SOUP5 10 gig E, the most recent code version, the same exact image will run on both of those. But it's easiest you just pick your supervisor. So assuming we're running a Supervisor Engine 6E, and then it has the Ramen software and the iOS software, and you're generally updating the iOS software. And then it gives you a list of choices. And it has the latest release, which is the 12.2.52 SG, and then all releases, 12.2 SG. Now, we didn't talk about the SG train at all, but that's a situation where you're going to run into. You're going to have to pick a code version, and you're not going to know anything about the train. So not knowing anything about the train, which of these code versions are more stable? Well, let's see. If you read the release notes, you'll see that new features are introduced when they rev this number. So the 12.2.46 to 12.2.50 is when they release new features. And then they did 2 rebuilds of it. And then when they revved from 12.2.50 to 12.2.52, they introduced new features. So to pick a stable code version, which one are you going to choose? You could pick the 12.2.52 SG, where new features were just introduced, or 12.2.50 SG2, which is 2 rebuilds since the last new feature was introduced. So you look at the release notes, you see what if you need any of those new features introduced. I would probably go with the 12250 SG2 because that has 2 rebuilds since the last release note, since the last feature introduction. And you see I haven't even looked at the release notes yet, and I've already got what I feel is a pretty good guess of what the most stable recent code is on that switch. So that's what understanding the iOS code versions can do for you. You don't want to just go and pick a random code version because then you might end up with a technology train or end up with a code version that, you know, the latest and greatest means the latest greatest features, which means the latest greatest bugs. Then once you pick it, here's the 12250 SG2. We have 4 options. We have the enterprise services options up here and the IP base options down here. Now, if I'm just deploying this as a layer 2 switch, then I would go with the IP base because I don't want any of the routing protocols or anything like that if it's just a layer 2 switch. If I need the routing protocols, then I go with the enterprise services. The other choice is whether to go with the crypto or not. The SSH, you can see the SSH has a K9 right there in the image, and this one without the crypto does not have the K9. The K9 means it has SSH. I always require SSH. So of these 4 images, for a layer 2 switch where I want SSH so I can log into the switch without having my password intercepted, I would go with the IP-based SSH image. And you can see, and here it is. So that's our first example choice. Now our next example choice, let's look at the iOS versions, and let's pick for like a 3845 router. We have the 12.4 family, where we have 12.4T and 12.4 mainline, and then down here you can see 12.2S, 12.2SX. You can see it's harder to find where the Cat6K would fit in, so that's why with the switches, you wanted to go with the switches software choice on the web page. So we're picking for the Cat6K, actually here I am picking for the Cat6K, and I went into the 12.2SX, and then here's my hardware platforms. Let's pick on a 6509 switch, and let's assume I'm running a SOUP. So we pick for a SOUP 720, and we have the iOS software. The boot images are field programmable devices. We generally pick the iOS software because we're just upgrading the core iOS software on the box. And then here's all the images that we have. And note, they've started to organize it in a way that makes sense. They have the latest releases of each feature release. So we have 12.2.18 SXF16, which we now know has 16 releases since the last major feature introduction. And then the more recent 12.2.33 SXH5, which has 5 minor releases since the last feature introduction. Or the 12.2.33 SXI1, which only has 1 minor release since the last feature introduction. So of those, the SXF16 is most stable, but if you need the 10 gig line, the 16-port 10 gig line card, then you got to have the SXH and 5, and then if you need the VSS, you need the SXI1. And then they have the older all the releases, including the older ones. Like if you really, for some particular reason, wanted the SXH4, you could choose that down here, but generally it would be rare. It'd be a rare circumstance that you want to do that. So this new iOS, the iOS website where they put the latest releases right at the top is really helpful because it eliminates most of these choices right away, gets you down to the 4, and then you just pick which one of the 4 based on what features you need. Now SXD7B is an even older version with many fewer features than the SXF. I wouldn't go there. I think that's just a little bit too old. There's a lot of stuff in SXF that's pretty useful. Okay, let's pick an iOS version in the 12.4 range, and we're looking at 3845 routers. And the latest mainline release is 12.4.25A, and then here's all the older mainline releases. And remember, in the mainline releases, they're not introducing new features. So generally in the mainline release, going with the latest one is the best option. The only exception is when a new mainline release is introduced. So if, for example, they came out with 12.5.1 mainline next month, I would not want to choose it. I'd want to let it. I'd want to let the mainline release burn in for a few months. Maybe have 3 to 6 months of mainline development before I was brave enough to go there. I might choose the 12.4 to stay on the 12.4 mainline instead of going to the 12.5 mainline. And then the technology train. If I went with a technology train, here you can see some images. 12.4.24T is the latest technology train image, but you definitely don't want to go there because a gazillion new features were just introduced there. If you look at your choices here, you've got 12.4.24T, 12.4.22T1, 12.4.20T3. So T3 at least has 3 rebuilds since the last feature introduction. Let's say you needed that 3G H-WIC card, which is introduced in 12.4.15T. Then the correct choice might be 12.4.15T9, which has 9 releases with 0 or minimal features since the feature that you needed was introduced in 12.4.15T. That'd be a lot more stable than a 12.4.24T, which just had new features introduced that you don't require. So the technology train as an example, we're going with the latest and greatest, is not the best option. You only want to go with the technology train if you need those features, and then you try to find one with a significant number of rebuilds since your feature was introduced. It's going back to packaging. In our Cat4K case, we went with the layer 2 or the LAN base because we did not need any other routing protocols, and then we just wanted basic switching. But if we needed OSPF, we'd have to go with IP services, and if we needed IPv6, then in SXH and earlier, we'd have to go with the advanced IP services. But now, starting with SXI and in the latest 12.4 images, IP version 6 is parity feature to IPv4. So if you have OSPF for IPv4 in a particular package, then you'll have OSPF v3 for IPv6 in that package, assuming that the box even supports IPv6, which is still sadly not a given. So here's some 12.4 image options. You can see we have the advanced security image, the enterprise base image, advanced enterprise K9 image. This is just a small selection of what we had in the 3845. You usually want the K9, and usually I would go with the IP services K9, or if I needed IPv6 and it was an older version that didn't have the parity yet, the advanced IP services K9 if I was deploying a router. Okay, so that's it for iOS version selection tactics. Again, the main strategy is to narrow down your choices by platform, narrow down your choices based on feature if you need some new feature or relatively new feature, and then try to pick a code version that has a substantial number of rebuilds since the last major set of features was introduced to try to maximize your stability. And that's it for today.